Are you the type to stop to smell the flowers? Did you know that by doing so, you're actually helping to pollinate and breed those flowers by dispersing the pollen? Today, I will be explaining to you the parts of a flower that help it to reproduce, which are the pistil and the stamen. I was a middle school teacher's assistant for about a year, so I taught this information, and I also did some extra research for this speech. I hope that by the end of my speech, you will gain some new information about the parts of a flower and how they work. So let's begin with the pistil. The pistil can be considered the female part of the flower. It's made of the stigma, style, ovary, and ovule. So let's break that down. The top here is the stigma. The stigma's main purpose is to catch any pollen. It does this by being sticky, and it also juts out from the flower, which is a evolutionary tool according to Britannica that helps it to more easily catch any pollen that might be flying in a breeze or be carried by another pollinator. It's connected to the plant through this tube, which is called the style. The style's main purpose is to transport the pollen down from the stigma into this pocket here. The pocket is called the ovary. The ovary's main purpose is to protect the ovule that's inside, and the ovule is the female gamete, which will become fertilized and later becomes the seed that can be planted. Now that we've looked at the parts of the pistil, let's look at the stamen. The stamen is made of the anther and filament. The anther's main purpose is to produce the pollen. It's also sticking out from the plant, similar to the pistil. And the pollen is just very lightly dusted on it so that any sort of breeze or pollinator can easily spread that pollen. It's connected to the plant through this cord, which is the filament. According to sciencing.com, the main purposes of the filament are to transport nutrients up to the anther so that it can produce that pollen, as well as holding it outward so that it can be caught by a breeze. Now I will talk about the ways you can use this information in breeding plants. So the first thing to keep in mind when you're breeding plants is that some flowers have only the female parts, some have only the male parts, and some have both male and female parts. If you're working with plants that have both male and female parts, it's important to keep in mind that you don't want them to fertilize themselves because this will create a lack of genetic diversity and can cause genetic problems in future generations. When you're breeding your flowers, you'll need to take two plants of the same species, but they can be of different variations or colors, which will create what's called hybrids. According to Summer Home's Nursery, hybrids can be really exciting and fun to make because you never really know which traits or colors will pass on to the future generations, so it can be a bit of a mystery how your plant will turn out. To breed your flowers, you'll need to take your two plants. The two most important parts of the flower when breeding are the anther and the stigma. So you'll need to take the anther from plant 1 off and make sure that when you do this, you don't touch the anther too much because you don't want the pollen to come off. As I said earlier, it's just very lightly dusted onto it. If you touch it too much and the pollen comes off, it may not be as successful of a fertilization. So you'll take the anther to the stigma of your second plant and rub the pollen onto the stigma for it to fertilize. Once this flower wilts off after however long, a couple days or maybe a week, that means that the fertilization process is through and you can remove the seed from the ovary and plant it in the ground. I hope that you learned something new about the parts of a flower and how you can use this information in breeding today. Remember, those parts of the flower are the pistil, which is made of the stigma, style, ovary, and ovule, and the stamen, which is made of the anther and filament. Next time you stop to smell the flowers, I hope that you remember all that makes it a great reproductive tool for plants. Are there any questions?
Is it possible to breed flowers from different species?
So it is possible. I think it might be possible for certain plants, but it's not as often. You never really know if it's going to fertilize properly. So if you're trying to breed new plants, it's a better idea to just work with plants of the same species because a lot of times the fertilization process won't fully take.
Are there other ways to tell that the fertilization was complete, or is the falling off of the flower kind of like the best way?
So yes, once the flower dies and falls off, that just means that it's gone through the full fertilization process. You might be able to take it off sooner, but that's the best checkpoint to know that it's going to be complete once the flower dies, because it's completed its process. The purpose of a flower on a plant is to reproduce. So once it falls off, it's completed its purpose.
What would be some of the genetic consequences for inbreeding plants?
So if you're using the same plant to fertilize itself, a lot of times the problem is that it's not getting any diversity from other plants. So for example, if it's susceptible to a certain disease, then all of the future generations will also be susceptible to that disease. Whereas if you were to breed it with another plant, it might be more likely to be able to combat more things because you're getting the DNA from both this plant and that plant. So that makes it more able to survive because it has all of the genetic predispositions to maybe be more likely to survive a disease or from bugs or certain things that might kill it.
Do you know if there's any flowers that are simply just ornamental, or they always have these structures for reproduction?
So that's the purpose of a flower, is to reproduce. So plants that have flowers are called angiosperms. And the purpose of having a flower is that that's how you know that's how it's going to reproduce. So they always have these insides of the pistil and the stamen, but a lot of times they look a lot different. For example, this is a lily. So all of the pistil and the stamen are hanging out, but all plants don't look like that. All flowers, I'm sorry, don't look like that. So sometimes they're more compacted down, but when they're out like this, it makes it easier for the pollen to spread, and it makes it more easy for the stigma to catch pollen. So it's easier to reproduce types of flowers that have their reproductive parts sticking out, but there are other flowers that have them more compacted. But if there are flowers on a plant, that means that that's how it's reproducing. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to end this call.